No problem. So aloha. I'm Dr.
Sorry.
Rhonda Mapuana Shizuko Hayashi Simpliciano. So when I present, as I was saying, I present under the name Fuji. Fuji is my Ainu name. It belonged to my father before me. Fuji is a family name that indicates sacred fire. I've given it to my two children after me, and I'm also going to give this name to my unborn child that's coming into the world. And for me, this name connects me to the genealogy to Apehuchi Kamui, who is, for lack of a better word, goddess of a volcano, but really that element of fire and warmth. And so I use this name because when I'm presenting, I like to get in this space of sharing heritage, ancestral knowledge, not on behalf of myself, but of my family and of my ancestors. And so today I'm going to be presenting on the topic of Ainu and Kanaka, a discussion on Pacific intersections. And before I get into that, I just want to acknowledge that the land in which we stand, Ko Hawaii Aina, has always been a safe place for Ainu in diaspora who have come to this island either through migration or because they were trafficked here to work during the plantation era. Kalamai Kalehua, can you go to the next slide?
I wish I could. I don't know what's going on. Is that the next slide?
It is, yes. And I don't know if you can do a share view so that they can see the slide bigger. We can play around with it.
Yeah, I am sharing it. I don't know what's up.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
But basically, with this slide, I wanted to just, pictures speak 1,000 words. And so whether prehistorically or in more modern times, Kanaka Maoli and Ainu have had pinina. They've had connections with each other. And so I'm going to be kind of getting into that and unpacking the different ways in which Kanaka and Ainu have shared in this pilina and relationship throughout Moana Nui Akea. Next slide, please. So I am a graduate of UH Manoa and a graduate of the TRHT cohort under Dr. Puni Late. In this cohort, it was really stressed to us the Mo'oku Auhau or genealogy framework, where you go into your genealogy of Ohana, your genealogy of Aina, and genealogy of Ike. Lots of times when you are in Ainu and you're sharing about your history and culture, it's like you're kind of bleeding openly these things. And so what I ask in return is just this feeling of reciprocity among the group. So that if you have a question, you can put in the chat anytime. But if you could just please state, the family, your family that you're representing, the Aina that you come from, and if appropriate, the Ike knowledge that you're quoting. So for example, I might say something like, my name is Mapuana. My Ohana comes from the Aina of Pu'ulo and Eva. We also come from roots in Ainu Moshiri. I learned from the manga Golden Kamui that Ainu do tattooing. Is that true? And what that does is it just helps me understand whether or not you're quoting an Ainu source or a settler source, and I can better answer and filter out your questions that way. Next slide, please. Inspired from the TRHT Mo'okua Health framework, I've created the Moshiri model, where we're looking at Ainu world, the time and existence through the Ainu world view. So historically, the Ainu saw Ainu Moshiri as their country, but also a physical plane and like a current time and space. There is also Pokna Moshiri, which is a mythical time and space where the ancestors dwell. And there's also Kamui Moshiri, which is a mythical time and space where it's the divine plane. And oftentimes that is where the Kamui will exist, and they will come down to earth in a non-human element. And so I mention this because it is through our creativity as Ainu. It is through our story sharing. It is through the sharing of history that past, present, and future all come together in one place. And so today, that's what I'm going to be doing. Next slide, please. Sharing with you our history and our stories. And why this need for group norms? Like I said, sometimes when you're an Ainu and you're talking about your history and culture, it is as if you are bleeding publicly. And so pictured here, I have Kettle and Kiku. These are Ainu children labeled as specimens that were on display in the 1904 St. Louis World Fair. We have a long history of being dehumanized as a people. We have a long history of the social imaginary informing the public of who we are. And so through sharing stories, I'm just going to give you perspective of us as Ainu in diaspora, of who we are and our history. And I hope to humanize us a little bit. Can you please, Kalehua, go to 6 minutes and 35 seconds of the video?
Sure.
I just want to show you other Ainu faces as well as Ainu stories. So 6 minutes, 25 seconds. And this is a gentleman that I interviewed for my dissertation. His name is Ed.
Embrace, like as a child, did you feel like I'm Japanese, or as a child were you like, I don't know if this is quite my community?
Actually, this is when I inquired with my mom. I actually asked her if I had been adopted because I didn't look Japanese, and she at that point explained who I was, and it still to this day bothers me. She had to hide it.
Okay, mahalo Kalehua. You can go ahead and stop that video and please go to the next slide. So, as you could see from Ed's reaction, our histories as Ainu in diaspora are complicated. This is part, because our emotional well-being as Ainu in diaspora can be compromised living among Japanese Americans due to our histories with one another. Ainu were enslaved. My family comes from a history of being indentured servants. That's how we even got to Hawaii. Ainu women were sexually assaulted by Japanese men with no legal recourse. In the Edo and Meiji periods, Ainu were thought of as subhuman, where Japanese perpetuated this narrative that Ainu were descendants of dogs. And this history has caused many Ainu in diaspora to hide their cultural identity. And, I talked a little bit about the social imaginary. Basically, that's, kind of what people think you are, not necessarily how you identify or what your authentic culture. So lots of times people either, when I say to them Ainu, they have no idea what Ainu is, or they'll be like, oh, you're from the hairy people, right? And then I kind of joking at this point say, I prefer the term hair blessed, if anything. But it's when you're constantly hearing bad about your culture, you tend to want to hide it. And so to protect us from that, our elders, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, it was kind of this thing where you just didn't say out loud that you were Ainu outside of the home. Next slide, please. Oh, that's going back.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. So quick overview of the Ainu and Ainuic populations. So Ainu people are an indigenous people across the areas of Japan known as Hokkaido and Honshu, as well as the Russian areas of Sakhalin, Kuril, and Kamchatka. The Ainu display striking cultural and artistic similarities to varying indigenous people of the Pacific and Pacific Northwest. Historically, the Ainu are known for their diverse dialect, genetic differences, shamanic practices, rituals, food, art, housing, and oral histories. In modern times, many Ainu have mixed with other subpopulations of Ainu and Wajin. Again, Wajin is East Asian settlers of the Japanese archipelago, both voluntarily and through forced assimilation in order into the dominant culture of the nations of Japan and Russia. Next slide, please. So I bring that up because it's important to say when we're talking about Ainu, Ainu really has become a political term, and we think of that as one people. But what I want to really stress today is that just like Native Americans, there are varying identities and even ethnicities within this umbrella term of Ainu. One of the maps that I use is from a researcher. Her name is Chisato Dubril, pictured here. And so a lot of times when we hear Ainu now, we think, oh, Hokkaido, Hokkaido. But historically, the bounds of Ainu Moshiri is the name of the homeland of the Ainu. The bounds were beyond Hokkaido, and they extended into Sakhalin, through the Kuril Islands, up through Kamchatka, and down into Honshu. And even though right now it's kind of a hot political issue, how far down into Honshu did Ainu culture and identity extend to? What was the bounds of this Ainu cultural complex? We know that through topography, through place names, and through language, the Ainu reach was quite far down south. Next slide, please. And so I just want to throw this out, right? Because what is Japan, right? People identify as Japanese. What is Japan? And so we get the term Japan from the way that Marco Polo documented it in his journals as Zipengu or Chipengu. And so one theory does exist that the eastern people of Hokkaido, as well as the Kuril Islands, which is a part of my heritage, we identified as Chuka Unkuru. And so one theory does exist that Marco Polo may not have ever even reached the archipelago, but he heard of the Chupka, the Chup, from the Mongolians and from Chinese who wrote it zip, 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 because they were mispronouncing the Chup. So, it's very possible that Japan as a nation and as an identity really is a mispronounced Ainu word to begin with. And so when I present, and again, this is debated, this is up in the air, but my feeling is that we've been so indoctrinated into the colonial narrative that it's important to have the Ainu narrative surface. Next slide, please. So again, Ainu is an umbrella term. And so even in Japanese documentation, there is, and currently acknowledged by the Ainu Association of Hokkaido, 3 different types of Ainu recognized in different ethnic and racial groups. Those were the Hinamoto, the Karako, and the Watarito. The Hokkaido Ainu today are said to be the Watarito. There is not a whole lot of evidence on where the Hinamoto and Karako went, right? It is said that the Hinamoto were very tall people. My great-grandfather that came here initially as the Ise, who was actually trafficked here to work in the labor in the sugar plantations, was a 6-footer. He was well over 6 feet tall. The Karako are also said to be tall with reddish hair. And there are lots, people, they contact me and they're like, hey, we have red hair in my family, but as far as we know, we're pure Japanese. What does that mean? Could we have Ainu heritage, right? So I just wanted to throw that out there, that Japan is thought of as the most homogenized, nation in the world. But again, that's a narrative that isn't necessarily genetically true. Next slide, please. So I'm super honored to be a co-founder of the Ainu and Inuit Heritage Education Society. And so we assist people in reclaiming their Ainu or Inuit family heritage based off of a combination of information, which is including but not limited to the Japanese family registries, which is the Koseki Tohon. Now it's important to realize that to be Ainu, to be indigenous, to be Buraku, actually hindered social movement, right? If you were labeled a dojin, if you were labeled an eta, you could not move forward socially in Japan, even until very recent times, systemically. So in the 60s, 70s, they ended up closing up the Koseki Tohon for this reason, to keep people's family registries private. Inuit family names, there are names that are associated with Ainu people as well as names found in Emishi hamlets. When we go and do archival research, we're able to pull some of those out. I also use genetic genealogy techniques. We look at family phenotype and physical traits, historical timelines of family migration, immigration, and emigration. Historical tax and census documents can often help us determine, what was a family's social status, spiritual worldview. What we're finding is when we talk to Ainu diaspora, there is a spiritual worldview that has been passed down through the generations, and that has not been lost. But also a shared cultural experience. A lot of us have dealt with a great deal of historical trauma due to displacement, due to imperialism, and that's kind of a shared culture that has been passed down through the generations that we're able to kind of talk with each other about and build understanding about. Next slide, please. So traditionally, Ainu didn't have any surnames. But in 1872, the Japanese created, a system of family registry. And as a result, Ainu villages, when we're talking specifically in the area of Hokkaido, were designated different names. So that kind of looked like an authority coming in, and whole villages, whole regions were given certain names. And so we have those well documented. So if you have these names, it can be an indication of Ainu heritage, depending if your family was from Hokkaido or not. But sometimes, like my family left the whole region before this era. So like Shoko told me one time, she's like, oh, Hayashi, that's not necessarily a northern name, right? So because we had no historical surnames, it was just kind of filled in whatever, whoever our owner, our clan, who we were working for at the time, right, designated to us. So some of these names sound familiar in Hawaii: Arai, Hirame, Hiramura, Hiranuma, Kawamura, Kaizawa, Kawakami, Kawanano, Kayano, Kimura, Kurokawa, Mamiya, Mono, Nabesawa, Nitani, right? So these are names that are not so unfamiliar to us here in Hawaii. And so just throwing out there that Ainu heritage is a lot more common than has been previously thought. Next slide, please. So Shioka had brought up earlier, we were going back and forth about the Jomon, right? So it's important to note that according to the Japanese historians, there are several Jomon tribes, and this is pretty much settled by historians without a whole lot of dispute. And so these were the Emishi, the Ainu, the Azumi. Now the Azumi, possibly Austronesian speakers. The Kumaso, again, possibly Austronesian speakers. The Azumi and Kumaso resided further down south in Kyushu. The Kumaso and Hayato are thought to be the same people, but they're documented differently. The Mishihai, the Saeki, the Tsuchigumo, the Takeshito, and the Kuzo. And the Tsuchigumo, this is a word that comes up over and over and over again. You're going to see these epic artistic depictions of samurai or really famous war generals, and they are in a battle with a spider. Essentially, Tsuchigumo is a derogatory term meaning earth spider. And so what they're referring to here is they're beating the indigenous people of the area. Interesting about that, when you're a geek like me and you get into genetic genealogy, right? Haplotype D isn't found just anywhere in the world. It's found in the Andaman Islanders, it's found in Okinawans, it's found throughout the Japanese archipelago and up through the Aleutian Islands. Ironically, the Tsuchigumo term was used in World War II as the Japanese were removing Aleutians, the Aleut people, the Unangan, from their land and from their islands as well. So when you look at it just genetically, you can kind of see a war on an entire people across the Pacific to really remove those people and displace those people from lands. Even though we have different ethnic identities today, and different cultural in languages today. Next slide, please. So again, who are the Jomon? It's important to recognize that the Jomon is not a people. You go to Japan today and you're going to see Jomon parks and people really identifying with this Jomon identity. But there is no one Jomon identity. Jomon was in fact the name of a pottery, a particular type of pottery, and it was not what people called themselves. It is actually more likely that prehistoric Japan looked more like what the Philippines might look like. Many different distinct ethnicities, cultures, localized cultures, speaking different dialects, and even the Ainu dialect today, right? I talked about this on Wednesday. There are 19 to 26 different Ainu dialects. Japan today, standard Japanese can be very dialectal. So you can imagine that the one Jomon identity just didn't fit historically. Next slide, please. So the Jomon dogu, or the things that archaeologists are digging up, is very interesting because there are disputes over whether or not these markings are tattoos, whether or not they're scarification, or whether or not there's something completely abstract. But when you look at these figures with that of documented Ainu tattooing before the tattooing was outlawed, we definitely see similarities. Next slide, please. So Taku Oshima is world-renowned tattoo artist. He's doing Jomon tattoos on people today. He's been a great help to me as I'm trying to revive this art of Ainu tattooing. But he notes of this Jomonic figurine that it's the same sinue, right? Sinue is our traditional Ainu markings around our mouth for Ainu women. And so this was a figurine found in Aomori. And so this kind of proves two different things. One, that Ainu, or this Ainuic type of a culture, existed beyond the bounds of Hokkaido and onto the island of Honshu, as well as that these markings could very well indicate the kinds of tattoos that we see in Ainu women. Next slide, please. So Ainu tattoos, they're actually very diverse. This is from the cartoon Golden Kamui. They can be regional. They can have specific meaning for one's family or one's social status, but they were also amulets. There is spiritual meaning. The Ainu were shamanic people. So this wasn't just for a tattoo for fashion. This was really for spiritual strength. Next slide, please. And so I just want to include some pictures. You can go to the next slide, of what the sinue, or in my people or dialect, we call it anchipiri, what this actually looked like on real people. Next slide. Yeah. So you'll see that, there was the anchipiri or sinue around the mouth, and oftentimes around the hands, extending into the fingers. Next slide, please. Yeah. Next slide. Mahalo. And I bring this up, in part because I think that it's important that we discuss the tattooing in terms of Pacific intersections. And again, this isn't necessarily my specific area of research, but I do believe that when you look at something like the Okinawan Hajichi, when you're looking at Ainu traditional markings, and when you're looking at Micronesian traditional markings, down through, Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, Moana Nui Akea in general, you're going to see, again, this cultural complex around tattooing where it's very similar, strikingly similar. Next slide, please. So visually, the traditional tattooing of Fiji around the mouth and the Ainu tattooing of the sinue or anchipiri look very similar. But more striking to me was the function of it and the way that it was done was similar. This is a matrilineal practice for both Ainu and Fijian women. It was typically done by, for Ainu, it was called a huchi or grandmother, a tattoo grandmother. For the Fijians, it was done by, an elder female of their family, of their community. And there were prayers that this tattoo grandmother would put into the mouth marking so that it could ward off shamanic attack. And so what's interesting to me is that in both cultures, you have not only this similar look, but you also have a similar function and in the way that the ceremony was actually applied. Next slide, please. So just a quick excerpt. This is from my husband and my children's mo'oku auhau, Tenteteki Ka'ihe, who was the father of Ka'ihe. Ka'ihe is noted in Kamehameha and his warrior Kekuhaupi'o to have battled Kekuhaupi'o with his spear. He was a part of the Pa'ele Kulani Maui warrior class. And we know from family stories that he had actually, Tenteteki Ka'ihe voyaged from Kiribati to Maui, got his family, came back to Maui. And so there was a very sophisticated knowledge about sea voyaging on the part of these indigenous people of Moana Nui Akea. Next slide, please. And so I bring that up in relation to Ainu, because I think it's important to note that these family stories, even in Hawaii, were not enough, right? When the Hokulea was just trying to get its foot off the ground and they were trying to get approval of these voyages, these family stories were not enough, right? We had to get the approval of somebody like Dr. Yoshiko Sinoro, beautiful man, right? And he was among the first of the anthropologists to say, yeah, I actually think that people could, the Aboriginal people of Moana Nui Akea could voyage from Tahiti to Hawaii and back, right? And so I think it's important to note, right, to ask ourselves, how are we thinking about and how are we learning about our histories of the Pacific? Is this through our authentic indigenous Aboriginal stories, or is this through the gaze of white and Japanese anthropologists? I think that that's a fair question that we need to be asking ourselves. And I think that this is important in the Ainu context, in the Japanese American settler context, because benevolent care is an educational policy that arose out of the Japanese Empire. And what benevolent care said was, it was important to enroll children in Japanese language, right? And so they did this with the Ainu, right? They took Ainu, they removed them from their culture and language, and the idea was to indoctrinate them into Japanese language and culture, right? And we know that this happened in Palau as well. Next slide, please. I love this quote right here. Colonial authors of written histories throughout the Pacific did not so much as erase indigenous representations and cultural expressions, but in most cases overwrote them, because Ainu wasn't a written language, right? And we know that many of our cultures throughout the Pacific, these were oral literacies. These were not written. And so I bring up this family story from my husband's genealogy, and I compare it to benevolent care, right? Were our histories overwritten? They were never erased. We still have these oral histories in our Ainu families, but it's not considered validated, which is one of the reasons why I started to publish around these things and to document the presence of Ainu in diaspora outside of Japan. So the Ainu contend with academic articles by non-Ainu scholars who label the community as endangered or even extinct. The ability of the Ainu to story themselves through creative literacies, both spoken and unspoken, have been a crucial component of the perseverance of the Ainu cultural identity. Next slide, please. So you might hear me use the word charanke. The word uko means mutually, and the word charanke means to let words fall. The compound word of uko charanke thus refers to the Ainu custom of settling differences by arguing exhaustively. It implies the Ainu do not solve disputes with violence. And this is from Kayano Shigeru. His book, Our Land Was a Forest, an Ainu memoir, is an amazing book. If you're interested in things Ainu, please do go get that book and read it. And so I always use this quote and this protocol of charanke to just drive home the point that, we are not a docile people. Arguing and debate is actually a part of our culture. And I always tell people, I would tell my professors in college, like, if I'm arguing with you or my classmates, that means I actually have respect for you and your thoughts and what you're saying, right? Next slide, please. And so, as Ainu and diaspora, we're kind of in this position where we have to argue our existence, even to say that we exist, we're not extinct. And this is something, unfortunately, even Ainu that have remained in Hokkaido have had to do. So, Ainu have always had to show resistance through their art. So when tattooing was outlawed, Ainu actually turned to textiles and making these very complex patterns out of Ainu textiles to ward off even attacks from Wajin. And so on the left, there's a picture of an Ainu standing up riding a horse. Now, this is ridiculous. We have no other documentation anywhere that Ainu actually rode horses standing up. But in a way to resist, because in the Ainu shamanic belief, if you took a picture of somebody, you were taking a piece of their soul. But it came to the point where Ainu were just seen kind of as a tourist trap, and they had pictures taken of them constantly without their consent. And then so you have things like this where Ainu were resisting doing wild things, kind of making fun of the social imaginary that were created about them. And so what I try to do in my art, next slide please, is through digital media, redefine our social imaginary so that you can see Ainu faces, you can hear Ainu voices. So in this video, I created this video because I was seeing in social media when there is a discussion about Mauna Kea and Japanese money backing the TMT. Lots of times I would see my friends, family, and colleagues say, oh, but they should go build them on Mount Fuji, right? Their sacred mountain. So I want to make clear that for Ainu, Mount Fuji is a sacred mountain, right? In a very different way than Fuji is for settler Japanese, right? For settler Japanese, Mount Fuji is a place of Shinto worship, it's a place of Buddhism and varying other different types of spiritual cults, right? For the Ainu, Fuji is the embodiment of Ape Huchi Kamui. The waters on Fuji are said to be the sacred breast milk of Ape Huchi Kamui. Very different. And so I think that for Ainu who want to be allies to Kanaka Maoli, I think our hope, we can learn from each other and from these stories so that, when we look at something like Fuji, we see the settler narrative, we don't see the Aboriginal narrative. So it's from this place that I created this video. Sorry, Kaleho, can you play, please?
Yep. Can you hear it and see it?
Since I was a baby,
Okay.
I have always connected to what is now known as Fujisan, and I guess in the Ainu language it was called Huchi. It's always what brings me peace. It's always what I feel I need physically and spiritually. To be honest, there's a quiet, magnificent being there, and I am sure that is how Kanaka Maoli feel when they go to Mauna Kea. As an Ainu identifying multiracial person, I had spent most of my life feeling othered by the Hawaii-born Japanese community.
Propaganda system really said that Japan was totally right. We could not disagree with the Japanese government or the emperor. And so everybody really believed that they were fighting a war against white oppression, right? Against Europeans and against Americans. And that Japanese felt that they were liberating Asia from white people and from Europeans who were colonizing Asia. All of a sudden, in the last 2 months of the war, I remember my mother. My mother was totally for the war. And they believed it all the way to the very end. In 1945, when they lost the war, what does she do the minute that happens? Totally tries to forget and deny and say that they took these positions whatsoever, right? But deep in their heart, they knew that what they did. That tendency is still there. There's those people who go to Mauna Kea and they culturally appropriate and they put up the Okinawan symbols and they sing the Okinawan songs, and then they have the Japanese flag. They perhaps even put up the rising star flag and things like that. And then they say, we're in brotherhood with the Mauna Kea people. It's a really false sense of nationalism and international brotherhood.
Charanke is an Ainu practice of arguing. If I were to ask you to make a charanke to education, or like this argument or plea to education about your needs as a diaspora Ainu, what would you say?
I would say, given that Aloha Aina is one of the founding themes in our accreditation statement, this sort of conception of self-determination and sovereignty and what comes with aloha, the sort of lokahi kind of unity of things. I think that it is incumbent upon an institution like the University of Hawaii to provide representation not only in student body but in administration and faculty as well. And this is an issue that's being addressed with the Native Hawaiian population and should certainly be expanded just on, the basis of logic alone, that, folks who come to the university want to see themselves reflected in leadership. It sounds like it would be in alignment with Aloha Aina. It sounds like it would be in alignment with doing the Pono thing, which is a part of the institution's, motto.
I knew nothing about Mauna Kea growing up here, but I understood the connection. Because if somebody told me that I could never go back to my temple, to go and be near Mount Fuji, that would break my heart.
Okay, mahalo Kalibo. You can go next slide.
Okay, but I think I have to stop sharing. Oh,
So I share that video because, I think that when we as Ainu and when we as Kanaka Maoli share our histories, and, I myself am both Ainu as well as Kanaka Maoli. Joe Kina'au, who was interviewed for the video, is Kanaka Maoli and Ainu as well. We exist in the University of Hawaii. Our families exist here, right? When we talk about the intersections of not just our cultures, but our histories, I think we can learn from each other about how to be better allies and about how to make our spaces of learning more indigenous friendly, right? In my dissertation, I talk about the Meiji lens, right? And this is a gaze on Aboriginality, which is heavily influenced by anti-Aboriginal propaganda, masked in history lessons within Japanese systems of schooling. So like you saw in Palau, where Pacific Islander children were re-educated to learn Japanese language and culture. This is the same thing that happened, right, with Ainu children. It was really modeled from Ainu children. And the Ainu word for school is ipakushnu chise, which is also the word for jail. So when you look at just language, right, school and education didn't have a positive connotation for those of us of Ainu ancestry. I'm first gen. In my school, in my history, right, my grandparents had maybe a third grade education. They worked on the plantations. So it wasn't, being in school wasn't something that I was raised with in terms of a focus where school was something that was a goal or a safe environment for me. And so I think what I'm saying, I currently work at Hulili Kekukui, our Hawaiian center. And so it's important, to have these spaces in these in our institutions of education that are safe for the Aboriginal identity. Next slide, please. And so, for my ancestors that came down to Hawaii, we have to understand that they dealt with the inculcation of the Japanese national identity through the Meiji regime, where they got a one nation, one language, one flag kind of a reorganization, right? And then they got it again, right? And so we see when the Hawaiian kingdom was illegally overthrown, right? We see we see children in Hawaii. And we know from Dr. Keanu Sai's research, this picture is actually borrowed from Dr. Keanu Sai's research, right? That children in Hawaii, and especially Japanese children, they were attacked with this inculcation. And this is this birth of this Japanese American identity, right? Where children were indoctrinated in, we give our heads and hearts to God, one country, one language, one flag. So it basically happened again. And so I think for Ainu and diaspora, it was this double, we can't be ourselves. We are labeled as barbarians, these hairy people. And, we have to go with the colonial narrative about who we are, which is extinct, right? And adopt this more homogenous identity. Next slide, please. Right. And so I really want to drive home that, Ainu actually means human. Kanaka actually means human. So this is my son. And so, I tried to raise him accepting both of, our heritage, who we are as Kanaka and who we are as Ainu. And, I think that this is important. This is kind of this really is the first generation where we've been able to do that. Gosh, I would say maybe four or five generations at least in my family. So we really try to embrace both our Kanaka Maoli language, our Olelo Makuahine, as well as our Ainu Itak, our Ainu language, and try to make our customs more visible as Ainu and our cultural identity more visible as Ainu. My son here is actually the first, he's clearly not the first Ainu born in Hawaii, but he's the first documented Ainu born in Hawaii. When he was born, I actually engaged in, a dispute with the Department of Health to put Ainu on his birth certificate. I was told by the Department of Health that Ainu is not a distinct race, and that basically Ainu is a dialect of Japanese. Now, if you sat in on my language class, on my language presentation earlier in the week, you'll know Ainu is a completely different language from Japanese. I benefited, and my son and family now benefits because the indigenous Ainu of Hokkaido went to the UN and they fought for indigenous recognition. And because of that, I was able to take that paperwork that was awarded to them, I believe 2007, 2008, around that time. My son was born in 2012. So even though I and my father and his father do not have it on their birth certificate, And my grandmother does not have that in her documentation. We were finally able to make that correction, on my son's official government documentation. Next slide, please. And so, this pilina, this relationship between Ainu and Kanaka Maoli and these intersections, they continue. In 2016, we hosted the governor of Hokkaido as well as Ainu youth down to Kekulakai Punio Anue Noe, and they came down to Hawaii to learn about the Hawaiian language immersion model in hopes to build a system of education where they can perpetuate heritage in language and culture. Just a month or two ago, Honolulu Community College and Hulili Keikukui welcomed Hokkaido University down to the campus, and Hokkaido Ainu scholars were able to talk with our faculty from the Hawaiian Studies Department, and learn how higher education is supporting the Hawaiian identity, language, and culture on campus. And so, I just want to emphasize that we're working with each other, we're talking with each other, and through these connections, I think that, it's important to say that Hokkaido Ainu are learning from our systems here of how we build and create, these indigenous serving institutions. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it. Yeah, so that's about all that I have. Does anybody have any comments or anything that they'd like to share?
Can I comment? Shoko, this is Shoko. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Mapuana, yeah, it was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. And then, it's always inspiring to learn something new. Yeah, I didn't know about the charanke. And then I wonder, no wonder I sometimes feel like, oh, I gotta fight.
Yes, yes. It's genetic and it's cultural. Ainu women, we fight. Yes.
Yeah, because in Japan, that because I went through a Japanese education, that like you mentioned, that everything and everyone is like a homogeneous. Everyone's supposed to be, follow this directions, and then we all have to be, under the the one sovereignty. Yeah, we have to admire the emperor and then that kind of things. Yeah, but to think about it, I kind of grew up in my father was a very rebellious person. And yeah, always criticizing the Japanese government, and then maybe what's happening in the world. But and then so I think I'm not sure if I'm a full, but I think I'm part Ainu myself. Yeah, and then it's very interesting. I wanted to learn more about those. I'm interested in anthropology. Like tattoos and things. And I'm debating. Should I get the tattoo right now? Yeah, but it's very interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Mahalo so much. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Kere, thank you so much for your comments. And and I think that's why I really am so thankful and so honored to be working at Honolulu Community College and to have colleagues at Kalehua, because we're here. We have Ainu students on campus, we have Ainu faculty, we have Ainu employees. And so, Kalehua is creating a safe space for that to surface. And so I really do appreciate that. And I'm able to benefit because I went to the university and learned about indigeneity and aboriginality through the Hawaiian Studies Department and learning about, you know, my own Kanaka Maoli history and identity, right? And so because it was a safe space to explore that, I felt like, why can't I explore my Ainu identity and culture and heritage, right? And so I think it only grows from there. So Shoko, I really do appreciate your comments. And again, this is not to bash Japan or the Japanese culture or to say that things are bad, but when the Hokkaido Ainu students came down, and some of them are now leading the charge in Ainu and cultural restoration in Hokkaido right now. Maya Sikine was one of them, and she's a language teacher right now doing wonderful YouTube videos for youth around the world to learn the Ainu language, right? One of the things that came up is the youth felt conflicted. Am I Japanese or am I Ainu, right? And as you know, Shoko, in Japan, it is so rigorous, the academics, that there's this fear. If I take time out from my academics to learn about my heritage things, will I get into college, right? And what I stress to them and what I stress to the cabinet from the government that came down to evaluate systems of Kayapuni and Hawaiian language immersion is that my world is only enriched by knowing that I am both Japanese and Ainu. I can see from two different perspectives. I am only enriched. I am not any less of a human being for learning that I am an Aboriginal person, right? That doesn't strip away from who I am. It adds to my experience, my worldview, and the way that I'm able to connect with people, right? So I'm really, I'm glad that we're able to kind of share this space together. I think as Ainu women, Shioko, and you know, be able to openly, you know, have this presence and help others feel comfortable about, you know, learning about Ainu history. So mahalo.
Mapu, in the last few minutes, do you want to play me to play the video? The hip hop one?
Oh, sure, if you want to.
Right. Haoli, did you have a question?
No, I did not have a question. I just wanted to mahalo Yaoi Mapuana. I think that this was just it was really amazing, and I think that when I think about what I know about the Ainu people, it's really not that much. And I think my first encounter was at WIPSI 2017, and it was just really nice seeing that representation there. But I think that your presentation is just a reminder that we are all indigenous to somewhere, right? We may not know it, but there are places that that we are very close to, right? And again, bringing up that idea about it's not as easy as just taking a telescope and putting it someplace else, right? Because those lands are important to a particular particular peoples. But just ku'u mahalo nui ya'oi, and I'm so excited and so stoked that you are on this campus, that we have you, that you can share all this wonderful ike with us. And I want to talk stories a little bit more later on, but mahalo nui. Kalamai.
Oh, mahalo ya'oi. Thank you so much for your comments. I'm very moved by that. But yeah, you know, and I think part of me wanting to share this about Ainu as well is to mahalo, you know, my Kanaka Maoli ancestors, community, and my colleagues, right, that are a community of Kumu, because you never know what you are inciting in your students when you're teaching them about Olelo Hawaii, about normalizing, you know, Aboriginal language and culture, right? When the students from Hokkaido, I have to share this story because in Kayapuni, it's not a thing to have a kumu with traditional markings and tattoos, right? Our po'okumu, our head of school, actually had maka, right? Full on tattooed face, right? And so when the students came from Hokkaido to meet us, first they were shocked to meet me because they had never seen a woman as well as an Aboriginal identifying woman in the position of a school leader. When they met our po'okumu, They completely looked him over because at first they thought culturally through the Japanese lens that he was a criminal, right? We were able to talk with them and get past that. And it's very interesting because historically for Ainu, even though tattooing was our spiritual power, it was outlawed, right? So it's that even today it persists that tattooing is something that is criminal, right? I was very inspired because Kumu Hau'oli actually allowed us to be a part of a traditional Filipino tattoo ceremony. My son witnessed that, who's also part Filipino, right? He was able to witness that at just age 10. And so I feel very blessed to be a part of this community of colleagues that are open to international culture and respecting Aboriginal culture, identity, and spirituality. So I think it's breaking generational curses, you know, that we're coming together on this campus, and how wonderful that our students can benefit from that kind of culture that is being set on campus. So yeah, mahalo to all of you.
Okay, do you want me to play it? And play the video as a last thing?
Sure, mahalo.
Okay. Here we go.
I was born Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan, the land of the Ainu tribe, the most ancient of all Japanese. Our island is a flat, cold place, and the least populated of all our islands. Once, it is the whole of Japan. Some claim that the Ainu are not Japanese at all, but that is like saying a Sioux or a Blackfoot is not a real American. Like they, we are a vanishing race, slowly becoming a memory, our only reality being that we too are wards of the government.
Take a good look at the goddess who shook fallacies that I found in your books. Imperial house are a den full of crooks. The impact of trauma's historical hooks are survivance ain't always as good as it looks, but we're Ainu. We are diaspora, and we are here.
Raised in Hawaii, where Japanese settlerism is prevalent, hip-hop became the structure of strength that I needed to establish that my Ainu heritage would not be inundated by Japanese culture. The rhythmic oration of rap artists were familiar because there were styles of Kanaka Maoli chanting or oli, and styles of Ainu storytelling, which were spoken rhythmically. I had a natural inclination towards composition and would walk around from an early preschool age, stringing together words of my own in a rhythmic manner. Perhaps, in another time, place, and culture, my talent would have been seen by an elder and I would have been trained formally in a traditional style of oration. However, amidst the neo-colonial Japanese influence on a highly endangered Ainu language, hip-hop was the specific culture that helped me to understand that local stories and people restoring their experiences hold power.
My father went to the internment camps, and the Japanese Americans were punished for what they were. My mother lost the war, and she lost everything. She became most likely a entertainment person, which is a euphemism, you know what I mean?
Take a good look at the goddess who shook fallacies that I found in your books. Imperial house or a den full of crooks. The impact of trauma's historical hooks. Our survivance ain't always as good as it looks, but we're Ainu. We are diaspora, and we're here. take a good look at the goddess who shook fallacies that I found in your books. Imperial house or a den full of crooks. The impact of trauma's historical hooks. Our survivance ain't always as good as it looks, but we're Ainu. We are diaspora, and we're here. Ancestors calling in, I take a stand. Stepped on this journey to know who I am. And here I find displacement from land. Feet never again to touch ancestral sands. More purpose than to be comfort woman. She stepped on the boat to this distant land. Without her, I'd never be who I am.
That's why I feel the way that I am. I can't help myself that I don't have the same strong feelings about being Ainu, exactly the same as what I feel for being Japanese or Japanese American.
Body so beaten it hurts just to sneeze. Praying and hoping that no one would see. Picture the young bride right after she bleeds. Bongo tag now, she got mouths to feed. All to escape homeland poverty. Who could blame her for having a dream, unaware of despair that her life would mean? So take a good look at the goddess who shook fallacies that I found in your books. Imperial house or a den full of crooks. The impact of trauma's historical hooks. Our survivance ain't always as good as it looks. Our survivance ain't always as good as it looks. But we're Ainu. We are diaspora, and we're here. I'm here.
It was a war bride. She suffered a lot. I have no doubt what she really did. And she kowtowed a lot of times. She always was saying, I'm sorry, sumimasen, I'm so sorry, that kind of thing. She was so polite. And it used to kill me to think how much she belittled herself. It used to kill me. I couldn't stand it.
Mahalo for playing that kalehua. I know that we're at our end right now. We're over time, but just to
That's
quickly
okay.
explain
I
what
loved
that was.
it. I wanted to play it. I love that.
Mahalo. What that was is I'm a hip hop ethnographer. So I was interviewing different Ainu and I would place their narratives over music. And I would, do multimedia types of videos to kind of show our stories and to humanize our stories. So in that rap, I'm talking about the history of human trafficking and sex slavery in my own family, for the Ainu women in my own family. And then the gentleman is talking about the realization that his mother was a prostitution and that he's Ainu, but heavily identifies as Japanese American. So that's what you were seeing. But thank you so much for sharing space with me and taking the time to attend this presentation. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Mahalo nui. Ie kere.